Hello ladies and gentlemen, in the video today we are going to be talking about Alekhine's defense, which is e4 and knight to f6. We'll be going over all of the main moves that you need to know in order to play this successfully. You're watching the Chess Geek channel. We upload every other day, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss out, and let's jump straight in to the video. Let's begin by talking about the main idea for black. It might seem that this opening is not so strong because white can go e5 and kick away the knight, and they can continue by going c4 and then d4, and white is grabbing a ton of space. Meanwhile, our knight is just getting kicked around. How could this be good for black? Well, our idea is this. We're in fact encouraging white to do this because our point is that white will get a very strong and menacing looking pawn structure in the center, but it's not going to be easy to maintain. We're going to slowly chip away at it with means of d6 and c5 and perhaps a timely knight to c6. We're going to slowly put pressure on these pawns, and because they're so far up extended, white won't be able to defend and sustain this pawn structure. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to start right now. In this position, we play d6, and we begin immediately putting pressure on them and asking them, how are you going to maintain this pawn structure? Now, I do want to very quickly back up for a second because some of you might be wondering, what if they don't play c4 here and instead go d4? Well, thankfully, this is just going to likely transpose. We go d6 now, again putting pressure, and at some point, if they want to play in the most ambitious way, they're going to have to go c4, and this again will just transpose into what I consider the starting position of the Alekhine's defense. Later in the video, we're quickly going to go back and look at some of the other alternatives, but this is what I would recommend spending most of your time looking at. So in this position, white has two options. The highly ambitious f4, they're basically doubling down on the center control. At the first sight of some resistance by us with the move d6, they don't care. They're going to keep putting pressure and trying to maintain the center at all costs. However, of course, this comes with the huge downside that we're going to exploit, which is the weakened king. The other option they have is the exchange variation, which is taking. And this is a bit more realistic, in my opinion, because they realize that we're going to put pressure on their center. They can't sustain it, so they're going to trade, get rid of the tension, and claim that they have a slightly superior pawn center control, even though it can't really continue being pushed forward. So how do we deal with both of these options? Well, let's first look at f4 because I find this is the easiest one to disarm because, again, it comes with a clear downside that we immediately can exploit. We're going to start by taking. They cannot take with the d-pawn ever because trading queens here is frankly quite suicidal because in an endgame situation, the extra space that these pawns give are far less meaningful, and instead, these pawns are now huge targets. So an endgame scenario in the Alekhine's defense almost always favors black. So going back, they're going to instead take with the f-pawn. And here we continue undermining their pawn structure, c5. Again, they can't take. We can clearly trade and target these pawns immediately. So going back, they're going to try to push forward d5, and we're continuing to get them to overextend. Now in this position, we continue with e6. We once again put pressure, try to chip away at their pawn structure, and what can they do? Well, the first option they have is to push. Now at first glance, this might seem really strong. They have a protected passed pawn. This is not something that looks very good. However, this is when you remember, wait a minute, a while ago they played f4. That came with some pretty severe weaknesses. We can now exploit it. The second we go e6, that's our idea. They get a good passed pawn. Who cares? They're not going to survive to be able to promote this pawn. We go queen h4 check. It's already game over. g3 allows this very typical and thematic tactic. They have to move their king, and I mean, we can proceed by taking this pawn. You know, this king is going to be able to be very susceptible to various checks. We can then continue developing in a number of ways. For example, if we drag the king over to the dark squares, one very typical idea is to go g6, bishop h6. You can explore this a bit on your own, but as the engine confirms and just look at the position, this is much, much better for black. So in this position, instead, white will go knight to c3. They're trying to take the sting out of the move queen h4 because now this square here is defended, so g3 is a possibility. But we're still happy to go queen h4, and I'll show this in action. We're going to take first with the idea of further weakening their pawns. Now they're literally isolated in the center. We go queen h4 check, and immediately we can take advantage of these weakened pawns with a move like queen to d4. You can see that this pawn is hanging with check. This pawn is in many cases weak. This is already putting a lot of pressure, so they're very much encouraged to take. But guess what? Again, an endgame position is good for us because these pawns no longer give the same space and advantage that they did before and are now simply targets. And that becomes abundantly clear when you look at the continuation. We take here, their knight is hit. They can try to go for some activity, but we defend the activity, we win some pawns. This pawn is also weak, this check is coming. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the move f4, a little bit too ambitious and aggressive. Let's now look at the exchange variation, a bit more common and realistic. We're going to continue by taking. Now, they're going to develop their pieces, we also develop our knight. Now, one of the key characteristics of this position is that although white has extra space in the center, it is not as scary as it might seem because these pawns are never threatening to push. If they push d5, they give away this really critical e5 square. If they push c5, well, we can take, trade queens, and in this specific position, we win a pawn, but even if we don't, this king is misplaced, we're happy. So going back, these pawns are sort of like a gate. They're aggressive, they're adding space to white, but they're not actually threatening to move and activate, and therefore we have the luxury of developing pretty normally. So let's see this in action. They go bishop e2, we go bishop e7, we develop, castle. We can then go bishop f6. This is often a very good placement for the bishop where it adds pressure to these pawns. And this is another thing I want to mention. These pawns are targets just like they were before. They're overextended and a little bit hard to sustain and defend. And therefore, we're going to try to put pressure on them. So let's say they go rook e1. We continue developing our pieces. Here they have many different options. One option they have is to go c5. But we can very clearly take this pawn, they take, and then trade off the queens. We can even take the knight and go knight a4 here, hitting both of the pawns. It is a double-edged position. They have the two bishops, a bit of, maybe extra development, a nice rook, but we're going to be winning a pawn here. Black is generally speaking, at the very least, equalizing here. The engine often even gives these positions as slightly better for black. For example, bishop d2, we take, and we're happy in this position. Up a pawn, very quick to also match their development. So going back, that's one of their options of c5. They can also go, for example, and play the move bishop e3 here. But one of the issues with bishop e3 is that now their pawn here is weak. So we can take and then just very simply win a pawn. And it's as simple as that. Now, they can therefore go b3 trying to defend that. But guess what? Now we take and we win the other pawn, something like this. And you can already see how it's starting to get difficult for white to navigate this position. They have these two very good, precious pawns, but they can't really defend them successfully. One of the other tries that they have is this move a4, and their idea is to go a5 at a timely moment, which will be advantageous for them. And so, for example, if we go and play bishop takes f3 here, they take, and if we want to take the pawn now, well, their idea is to then go and play a5 and hit our knight and then go a6. And although we're up a couple of pawns here, it is a very difficult position to play because after takes, knight to a5, it is clear that white has pressure. They have the two bishops, a very open position. Their pieces are activated. They have the b file. We don't want this position. We're up material, but we lack a lot in activity. So going back, a very simple way you can meet a4, and this is something pretty important to know, just go a5. Stop them at their tracks. They can no longer continue, and we're happy. And that right there takes us to the end of the exchange variation. Hopefully you saw it's not so scary. We develop our pieces, and it gets very difficult for them to defend the two center pawns. The final thing that I want to end the video with is what if they don't even go e5? This is a question you might have wondered. They don't have to go e5, but if they don't go e5, let's say they develop their knight, this is just going to transpose into a different opening, and you really have the luxury of picking which opening you want that to be. And so, for example, here, if you're comfortable in the Vienna, you can go e5 and, play out this position here. You can play the mainline Vienna. If you know this position, that's a great way to suit Alekhine's defense. Now, alternatively, if you're not so comfortable in that position, you can go d5. And they can push, and then you can go knight to d7, and you can play this sort of position. We reach a situation that's kind of funny, both of the knights in the center. It's a very interesting situation and opening that you can play. But if you're not comfortable in this, there's no shame in going d6 either and trying to slowly build up e5, maybe c5, developing your pieces, maybe going e6 and, playing a bit more passively and then castling. This is really a situation where I no longer feel that comfortable giving you advice because it's so open-ended. You can take these positions a million different ways. Similarly, if they go knight f3, you can play this so many different ways. You can go d6 here, you can develop your other knight here. So I would recommend very briefly looking at the move knight to c3, knight to f3, and kind of ask yourself what position can this transpose into that you're comfortable with. But aside from that, if they go e5, this video should be a great guide. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new around here. Like this video if you learned something new from it. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.